Kevin Deal here, and on today's episode, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Mamiya C330. So here is an original Mamiya C330, and I have the 180mm f4.5 attached to it, which is a really cool portrait lens. And it's a modular camera system containing a galaxy of accessories, but the main parts are the body, the viewfinder, and the lens. Speaking of the lens, the Mamiya C330 is a twin lens reflex system. You may notice something a little unique about this camera, and that is that it has two lenses. The lens on top is your viewing lens, and the lens on the bottom is the lens that actually takes the picture. And now I did say takes the picture because this uses a leaf shutter, so the shutter is not actually in the body, the shutter is in the lens. Another interesting thing about this camera is it shoots in a square crop. In the world of Instagram, that certainly makes it pretty easy to use since you don't have to crop out part of the photo. If you're shooting with the intention of a square, it'll turn out exactly the way you want it. You look through a viewfinder, which in this case is a waist level finder. It also has a magnifier, which is pretty cool, so you can see your image a little bit more clearly. As I mentioned, this is the original C330. It was produced in the 1970s. It was aimed at the amateur market. It was succeeded by the C330F, which I actually own, and I have a C330F right here. I showed you that my C330 used a waist level viewfinder, which is great. However, on this one, I have a prism viewfinder. The prism viewfinder is nice because the waist level finder, when you move right, things move left inside your viewfinder, and when you move left, things move right, and that can be pretty confusing. Another cool thing about the C330 system is that it has interchangeable lenses. I actually own about half a dozen lenses for this system, which I'll get into here in just a bit. So as I mentioned, this is the C330F. I find that the mechanics on it are a little nicer than my original C330. It's a little bit easier to operate. It was replaced by the C330S, which I don't own a copy, but it was a slightly improved version as well. The nice thing is that all the lenses work on all the different models of this camera. The C330 in general replaced the C33, which goes back before the 1970s. If you want to operate the camera, if you look right here, this is where your aperture and shutter speed are. And as you move the dials, you've got your shutter speed, and then your slider moves your aperture. And this camera goes from 1/500th being the fastest to up to a second, and then you can put it in bulb mode if you want. So to take a picture, all you got to do is push this silver shutter release, or on the side of the camera body, there's a black shutter release. So just keep in mind there's two shutter releases. Then you crank it, and you're on to the next shot. Another cool feature is the modular viewfinder system. You can do a waist level finder, you can do a prism finder. Now I'm going to show you how to install the viewfinders. In order to fit the viewfinder to the body, all you have to do is grab the viewfinder, seat those grooves in the front part of the viewfinder into those pins that are sticking out. Then you seat the back groove where that pin is. You simply turn it clockwise to tighten it, wiggle it, and just make sure it's secure, and then you're good to go. Alright, let's talk about changing lenses. Pick up the camera, and on the non-crank side, find this dial. Change it from locked to unlocked. When you unlock it, it puts a shield over the film and protects it. Now put the camera on its back and grab this wire up top. Pull it down and towards you and swing it open. Now, remove the lens. Grab the lens on the left, and if you see the lower right part of that lens, there's a blue dot. That's the lens's shutter cocking lever. It always needs to be set to the lower right. Now seat the lens and wiggle it into place. Close the wireframe and put it back into that slot. And now make sure you turn that dial back to locked. And then if you don't have film in there, you can go ahead and do a test fire. And you're good to go. Crank it again, give it another test fire. I recommend practicing this without film so you can get used to the feel, so that way you don't waste any frames out in the field. I actually finished a roll of film on purpose. I left a couple shots open because I wanted to demonstrate it. So this is what it sounds like when you're done. Take the film out. All you do is you turn this knob right here. All you got to do is turn it clockwise. So I'm going to turn it. Once this is turned, you just pop it the direction of that. And there's your film. In order to take the roll of film out, you just pull this pin and then remove your film. Now take your bottom spool and transfer it up to the top spool so it can catch your next roll of film. Alright, to put film in, make sure you have an empty spool up top. Never throw away your spools. They're good to have around. If you don't have a second spool, you can't use film with this camera. You see those little knobs on the side? Pull them out, and then make sure that the little pin in there aligns with the hole on the spool. Pull that pin and drop it into place. You may have to wiggle it around, but it'll snap. Now, you see this little leader? Pull it out. There's a little groove right there. Put it in that groove. And then hold it in place with your finger while you gently crank. And then you crank until you see arrows. Now the arrows need to align with the red dots you see right there. Slowly crank, and nope, you see that arrow? Line it right up there with the red dots. Alright, so now that those red dots are aligned, let's go ahead and close our door. It's just the opposite process. You turn it counterclockwise to lock it. Now, the next thing you want to do is you need to crank until your number hits 1. So keep turning the crank. And now, make sure your number is at 1. The next thing I tend to do is I lock it. So this is your lock right here. Just move it. Then that way you don't have any accidental triggers. And that's really it. Let's talk about some cons of the camera. So the camera, as I said, uses a viewing lens and then a lens that has the shutter in it that takes the picture. Well, you have something that's called parallax. And when you look through the viewfinder, you'll see this little line. And when you see that line is telling you this is what the actual crop of the image is going to look like. So that can kind of throw you off a bit. You do get used to it after a while, but just want to make sure that you know that very important fact about the camera. Another con of the camera, that even though I told you that having an interchangeable lens system is a pro, changing the lenses itself can kind of be a pain. Another quirk of the camera that can be perceived as a con is if you bump the multi-exposure switch, you can take a bunch of shots on the same frame. Now, if that's your intention, great, it's a cool feature to have, but you can bump it and you can take a bunch of exposures. Another con of the camera, and this is a con of PC cables in general, is sometimes they're finicky, sometimes you have misfires, sometimes it doesn't trigger. Another thing that I've noticed is if you're gonna use off-camera flash, my trigger is gonna be up here. I may have to get some sort of an extension to extend out and put my trigger out here. That's not a big deal, it's just more stuff you have to buy, and it's something that I want to make sure you understand before you buy the camera, especially if you're using a handle like this, is that you can't really put your trigger on here. You're gonna have to have some sort of an attachment if you decide you want to use the prism finder. Now, I do find that when I use the waist level finder, it's totally fine. I can just attach my trigger where it normally goes, but if you're gonna use the prism finder, you do have to extend that out so you can use the prism finder. Something else that can be perceived as a con is when you focus, you have to use a bellows system, and it's manual focus. To me, that's not a big deal, but to you, you may be used to your autofocusing system inside your Canon or your Sony or whatever, and you may not like manual focus. Well, tough. Also, there's no meter on this camera. You can go out and buy a meter. You can use a metering app on your phone. You can use the old school Sunny 16 rule,
Or you can do what I do, which is I take a test shot in digital and then I finish it on film. I simply just copy the settings over.
I find that on my original C330, the little crank arm that you use is not as easy to crank as on my F model. But in general, it works just fine. Either of them, though, feel like tanks. They are very well built. Another con of the camera, when I compare it to my Mamiya RB67, is you cannot take the film out of the back. You have to use the roll of film, and you're stuck with it. So that could be something where you're like, oh, I want to take a shot in color. Now I want to take that same shot in black and white. I mean, I have to have two C330s to achieve that. You can't do that like you can with the RB67. You simply remove the film back and put a different film back on with a different film stock. This is also the biggest advantage if you decide to spend the extra money and get a Hasselblad because it uses removable backs. If you're a studio photographer, it's not very bright looking through any of the viewfinders, so you may have to have a really bright modeling lamp, and if you're not willing to do that, you may just have to use this camera solely outdoors. One kind of cool thing about it, though, that you could also do is that it doesn't have a max shutter sync speed like you do with digital cameras. You can shoot it at 400th of a second and leave the lights on, it's just you can't see what your modeling lamp's doing. Now, I mentioned the crop factor being kind of cool for Instagram. That could also be a negative for you. If you're used to shooting 2x3 or 6x7 or 5x4, this camera doesn't do that. It shoots a square. So if you're going to crop your images to look like what you want and you don't want a square, you're going to be missing some of the image after you crop it. So just keep that in mind if you're not into square images. I've run into multiple mechanical issues with the camera. Sometimes it just doesn't fire and I got to figure out what's going on. Sometimes it's easy to bump the lock button, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. You can just switch the lock button back into place. So let's talk about some of the pros of the C330. I think that having interchangeable lenses makes it a really versatile camera. I also like how light it is. Now, compared to like a mirrorless camera, you're not going to think it's light, but compared to my Mamiya RB67, oh my gosh, this thing is worlds lighter, even when you outfit it with a heavier lens, a viewfinder, a prism finder, a handle. It's still much lighter than my RB67. Honestly, it's about the same weight as my Canon R5 when I have a 28-70 f2 on there. I find that loading the camera is pretty easy. I haven't run any rolls of film through it on accident. Another thing I really like about this camera, and I showed this on my review of the RB67, Mamiya actually puts a place on the back where you can rip off your box of film and put your film stock on the back. So that way you know what kind of film you're using. One thing I will say I love about this camera is you can get the bodies for pretty cheap. You can get the lenses for pretty cheap. I almost say it's like a poor man's Hasselblad. Hasselblad shooting a square. I'm not claiming that this camera is better than a Hasselblad, but I am saying you can take images that look pretty darn close for a fraction of the price. So some of the lenses that I have the 105mm. The 105mm is a pretty standard lens. I'm pretty sure it was the kit lens that came with a lot of these. 105, if you multiply that by 0.55, is about 57.75, which is somewhat close to what you see with your eyes. It goes down to f3.5, which is pretty wide open. Okay, so let's talk about the crop factor of a 6x6. My favorite lens for shooting portraits is this guy right here. This is the 180mm f4.5. You hear 180 millimeters, but for those of you in that full frame mirrorless world, this actually comes out to 99 millimeters. So you basically take it and multiply it by 0.55 for a 6x6 crop factor. I also have a 135 millimeter, which is kind of somewhere in that 75 millimeter range. This lens also goes to f4.5, which is fairly wide open for a medium format lens. Now I'm going to show you my 80 millimeter. This comes out to 44 millimeters in the full frame world. This is your normal angle of view. This lens is going to give you closest to what you're going to see with your eyes. And this lens actually goes to 2.8, so it actually shoots pretty wide open. I definitely recommend it for street photography. This lens right here is a 55mm f4.5, which gets fairly bright and wide open. This is pretty good for environmental portraits if you want to pull back wider than, say, 50mm in the full frame world. This lens will get you right around 31 millimeters, somewhere in there. So it's kind of like a 35mm. It would work good for portraits or street photography or one of those genres of photography.
All right, so what are my takeaways from today? If you're looking to get into the medium format game and you're not sure which format to get into, 6x6 may be your intro into it. A lot of people don't want to carry around those big 6x7s and tripods. They're really heavy. If you want to do handheld work and maybe you can't afford a Hasselblad, maybe look into the C330. As long as you're okay sacrificing changeable backs, it's actually a really good system to get into medium format with. You can handhold it, you can walk around with it, you can shoot street photography with it. I personally am now using it for my location shoots because I don't really feel like hauling around my RB67 when I'm running around outdoors. Now, it is a bit of a hipster camera, but that also makes it a conversation piece. You start with a client who might be a little nervous and they ask, hey, what's that funny looking camera? You get into a little small talk over it, and the next thing you know, your client's relaxed and the session's going smoothly. I personally like the charm of the 6x6 format. I think it adds something unique to my portfolio. I don't really care about the Instagram aspect of it. Instagram's going to go away someday, but I really like to shoot photography in squares sometimes. Now, the camera isn't without its drawbacks. Like all these 40 plus, 50 plus year old medium format cameras, you have to maintain them. It's not like owning a mirrorless camera from Sony or Fuji or whatever, where you just turn it on, it works, everything's auto this, auto that. You have to really run this like a machine, which is what it is. Despite all of those issues, it draws a lot of us photographers to it because of the quality. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with some of my favorite shots I've taken on the C330 system. Thanks for watching this video today. If you like what you saw, if you found it educational, please click the subscribe button below, like it, and then if you have questions or you have some feedback you want to give me on my videos, maybe you have questions about the C330, something I didn't go over, or you have something you want to chime in on about the C330, tell me in the comments below. Until next time, I'll see you soon. Bye.